The cellar exists beneath a city that no longer behaves like a city. Above it, streets have lost their names and buildings have lost their purposes, reduced to silhouettes of brick and smoke that stand only until the next concussion decides otherwise. Down below, the cellar is a compressed refuge carved out of necessity rather than design, a low-ceilinged cavity where the air feels used up before it is breathed. The walls sweat with dampness, and the floor is cold enough to seep into bone. This is where the civilians have gathered, not because it is safe, but because it is the last place left that is not immediately lethal. The war has driven them downward, away from windows, away from streets, away from anything that might draw attention from the sky or from passing boots. Hunger is the first constant. It is not the dramatic hunger of sudden deprivation, but the slow, gnawing absence that becomes a background noise to thought itself. Stomachs tighten and release in dull waves, a rhythm as familiar as breathing. Whatever food was once stored here has long been divided into increasingly small portions, each redistribution accompanied by quiet calculations and unspoken guilt. No one eats without noticing who eats less. No one finishes a scrap without wondering how many days remain. Hunger erodes time, turning hours into something shapeless, measured only by how long it has been since the last mouthful or how far away the next might be. Fear is the second constant, sharper and more alert than hunger, always scanning for change. It lives in the ears, trained to distinguish between the sounds that matter and the ones that do not. The civilians learn the difference between distant artillery and nearby collapse, between aircraft passing overhead and debris settling somewhere close enough to matter. Every vibration through the ground is interrogated. Every muffled shout from above carries the potential to become the moment that ends the hiding. Fear keeps them still when instinct urges movement and silent when bodies crave noise, conversation, or even argument. The cellar does not allow for emotional excess. Everything unnecessary is stripped away. Light is scarce and treated carefully, rationed like food. A single lamp or candle is used only when absolutely required, its flame a liability as much as a comfort. Most of the time, the cellar exists in a dim gray half-world where faces are known by outline rather than detail. Shadows blur the distinctions between age and youth, between neighbors who once lived comfortably apart. In the darkness, social hierarchies collapse. What remains is proximity. People are close enough to feel each other's breath, to register small shifts in posture, to sense discomfort without words. Privacy has vanished entirely, replaced by a collective endurance that no one openly acknowledges but everyone depends on. The cellar smells of damp earth, unwashed bodies, and fear that has nowhere to go. Clothing is worn too long, shoes never removed, as if the act of loosening laces might invite vulnerability. Blankets are shared, not out of generosity but necessity, layered over shoulders in arrangements that shift as temperatures change and people try to sleep. Sleep itself comes in fragments. When it arrives, it is shallow and easily broken, interrupted by sudden sounds or by the mind replaying memories of normal life with a clarity that feels almost cruel. Dreams, when they come, are vivid and disorienting, making waking feel like another kind of loss. The cellar compresses time in unnatural ways. Days stretch without markers, and nights are indistinguishable except by the quality of sound above. Sometimes there is movement overhead, heavy and purposeful, suggesting troops or vehicles. At other times, the city seems abandoned, its silence so complete that it becomes unsettling in its own right. In those moments, fear shifts shape. The absence of noise raises its own questions. Is the fighting over, or has it moved closer? Has the city been taken, or erased? No one knows, and speculation is dangerous. Hope is rationed even more carefully than food, because false hope carries its own risks. The civilians speak rarely, and when they do, it is in murmurs that barely disturb the air. Conversations are practical, focused on immediate needs: how much water remains, whether the ceiling has cracked further, whether the sound heard moments ago was real or imagined. Anything beyond that feels indulgent. Memories of before the war surface only occasionally, often triggered by something small, a smell, a word, a sound, but they are quickly suppressed. Nostalgia has weight, and weight is difficult to carry when survival already demands everything the body and mind can provide. Children, if present, learn the rules of the cellar faster than anyone. They understand silence not as a request but as law. Their movements are restrained, their questions swallowed before they fully form. Fear teaches them quickly, shaping behavior without explanation. Adults watch them constantly, not only to protect them, but because they are reminders of what is at stake. Every cough is stifled, every whimper smothered by a hand and a whisper that barely qualifies as sound. The cellar trains everyone to police themselves. Outside, the war is vast and abstract, driven by strategies, borders, and decisions made far away. Inside the cellar, it is immediate and intimate. It is the ache in joints that have been crouched too long. It is the dryness in mouths from speaking too little and drinking too carefully. It is the constant readiness to flee deeper into the darkness if the door above opens too abruptly. The civilians are not thinking about victory or defeat. Those concepts belong to another world. Here, the only goal is to remain undiscovered for one more hour, then another. The cellar walls bear the marks of previous use, scratches, stains, perhaps the faint outline of writing long since faded. These traces suggest that others have hidden here before, in some earlier crisis, and survived. That thought offers a thin, fragile comfort. If the cellar has protected people once, perhaps it can do so again. But the war outside feels different, larger, more consuming. Each explosion above seems closer than the last, each tremor more decisive. The building overhead groans under stress, and the civilians imagine the weight of it collapsing, sealing them inside permanently. This fear is unspoken but shared, hovering at the edge of awareness. As hours pass, bodies adjust to the darkness. Eyes strain less, ears sharpen more. The cellar becomes a kind of organism, its inhabitants attuned to its smallest changes. A new drip of water is noticed immediately. A shift in air pressure raises collective attention. When footsteps are heard above, everything stops. Breathing slows. Hearts pound loud enough to feel but not loud enough to hear. In those moments, fear is total, consuming every thought, leaving no room for anything else. The civilians do not know who controls the streets above them now. Control has changed hands too many times to track. Each shift has brought new dangers, new rules, new reasons to hide. They have learned not to assume mercy or cruelty in advance. Assumptions are dangerous. All they know is that discovery almost never ends well, regardless of who does the discovering. Uniforms mean power, and power has rarely favored those hiding underground. The cellar, for all its misery, offers one advantage: invisibility. It erases them from the map of the war, reducing their presence to a rumor at best. As long as they remain silent and unseen, they exist in a narrow space between life and death where neither side can fully claim them. That space is shrinking, though, and everyone senses it. Supplies are dwindling. The structure above them is weakening. The war sounds closer, more deliberate, as if it is no longer passing by but searching. In this suspended state, morality feels distant and abstract. Right and wrong have little relevance compared to necessity. Decisions are made based on survival rather than principle, and no one judges anyone else for it. The cellar enforces a kind of grim equality, where fear overrides ideology and hunger dissolves old grievances. Whatever differences once separated these people have been flattened by the shared reality of hiding together beneath a city that no longer protects its own. By the time the chapter of their waiting draws toward its end, the civilians are worn thin, not broken, but stretched to their limits. Their senses are overloaded, their bodies depleted, their nerves raw. They have become experts in endurance, though none of them would ever choose this expertise. The cellar has reshaped them, teaching them what it means to exist with nothing but uncertainty and restraint. Above them, history is moving forward with force and noise. Below, in the darkness, life persists quietly, waiting for whatever comes next, knowing that when the door finally opens, there will be no time left for preparation. The moment the door opens is not sudden in sound, but sudden in meaning. There is a shift in the air first, a subtle disturbance that reaches the cellar before light does. Those inside sense it instinctively, the way animals sense pressure changes before a storm. The war, which has so far existed as noise and vibration above their heads, has found an opening. The barrier between hiding and exposure, fragile as it has always been, finally gives way. What follows is not chaos, but an almost unbearable stillness, as if the cellar itself holds its breath. Light spills downward in an unfamiliar shape, sharp at the edges, cutting through the darkness that has become normal. It is not warm or welcoming. It is investigative. It reveals too much at once, faces pulled thin by hunger, eyes widened by fear, bodies arranged not for comfort but for concealment. The civilians squint and recoil, their pupils slow to adjust after so long without brightness. For a split second, instinct urges them to retreat further into the shadows, but there is nowhere left to go. The cellar has already been reduced to its deepest point. The figures standing at the threshold are silhouettes at first, framed by the ruined world above. Boots are visible before faces, planted firmly, confidently, on the edge of the opening. Weapons are present, unmistakable even in partial shadow. The civilians recognize the posture immediately. This is authority. This is control. Whatever happens next will not be decided by those crouched below. The war has finally looked directly at them. Fear surges, sharper and more focused than anything they have felt before. This is not the generalized fear of bombardment or collapse. This is personal, immediate, directed. Hearts accelerate, breath becomes shallow, and muscles tense despite knowing that resistance is impossible. Some avert their eyes instinctively, as if looking away might soften what is coming. Others stare upward, unable to look anywhere else, searching faces for clues they may not want to find. The civilians' thoughts fragment under pressure. There is no single shared expectation, only a cluster of fears shaped by rumor, memory, and experience. They imagine interrogation, separation, punishment. They imagine being herded out into the open, exposed to a sky that has long ceased to feel protective. They imagine accusations they cannot disprove and consequences they cannot escape. The war has taught them that discovery rarely ends with simple acknowledgement. It usually escalates. The soldiers do not rush in. This restraint is confusing, almost unsettling. There is a pause that stretches beyond what fear expects, long enough to feel deliberate. The civilians cannot tell whether this pause is tactical or human. In the silence, the smallest sounds become unbearable. The scrape of a boot against wood, the click of equipment shifting, the involuntary breath of someone who has failed to suppress it quickly enough. Each sound feels like a mistake, like evidence. As the soldiers descend into the cellar, their movements are controlled and economical. They do not fan out aggressively, nor do they bark commands. This absence of immediate violence creates a strange dissonance. The civilians have prepared themselves mentally for brutality, and its delay is almost more frightening. The unknown stretches longer, forcing the mind to imagine multiple outcomes instead of bracing for one. Hope flickers briefly, then is pushed aside. Hope has betrayed them before. The uniforms become clearer as the soldiers step fully into the dim light. Details emerge: insignia, straps, the wear-on fabric that suggests long use rather than ceremony. These are not faceless abstractions but individuals shaped by the same war, though from a different position within it. The civilians register this unconsciously, even as they struggle to reconcile it with their fear. These men are not monsters, but they are not saviors either. They are something in between, and that ambiguity is dangerous. Eyes meet across a short distance that feels enormous. The civilians' gazes are heavy with expectation and resignation. They do not plead. Pleading feels pointless at this stage. They wait, rigid and silent, their bodies betraying what their voices do not. Hunger has stripped away any ability to perform dignity convincingly. Fear has stripped away defiance. What remains is exposure. The soldiers' eyes move across the cellar, taking in the scene. They see the cramped conditions, the improvised bedding, the lack of supplies. They see people who are not armed, not organized, not prepared for confrontation. This assessment happens quickly, but its implications unfold more slowly. The civilians sense the evaluation taking place and feel themselves reduced to variables in someone else's calculation. Are they a threat? Are they worth the time? Are they a problem to be resolved or an inconvenience to be managed? For a moment, ideology hangs in the air, invisible but heavy. The civilians know what side they are supposed to represent in this encounter, just as they know what side the soldiers represent. These categories have been reinforced by years of propaganda, fear, and loss. But in the confined space of the cellar, those categories feel less stable. The war's grand narratives struggle to fit into a room this small, filled with people who look more exhausted than dangerous. The soldiers' faces begin to resolve more clearly as the light adjusts. Lines of fatigue are visible there too. These are not triumphant conquerors fresh from victory, but men worn down by prolonged conflict. The civilians notice this despite themselves. It complicates their fear, introducing an unfamiliar element: recognition. Not identification, but acknowledgement. The war has marked both sides, though in different ways. Still, fear dominates. The civilians do not dare to interpret the soldiers' expressions too generously. They have learned that apparent kindness can be temporary, strategic, or illusory. They have learned that restraint can precede severity. The cellar remains charged with tension, every person aware that a single word or gesture could tip the balance irreversibly. Time stretches again, though now it is dense rather than suspended. Seconds feel weighted, each one carrying potential consequence. The civilians become acutely aware of their own physical presence. The sound of breathing, the ache of muscles held too tightly, the dryness of throats. They are conscious of being watched, not in a distant or abstract way, but intimately, at close range. This kind of scrutiny strips away the last remnants of concealment. There is nothing left to hide behind. The soldiers finally speak, though their words are not immediately audible to everyone in the cellar. Tone matters more than content in this moment. The sound is controlled, not sharp. It does not explode into the space but settles into it. The civilians listen not for meaning but for intent. Is this the beginning of commands, or the opening of a different kind of interaction? No one moves until they are certain. The cellar's silence deepens rather than breaks. Even as voices are introduced, the underlying quiet remains, heavy and deliberate. It feels as though the room itself is waiting for a decision to crystallize, as though the walls and floor are holding the memory of previous outcomes and refusing to predict this one. The civilians sense that this moment will define what comes next, not only physically but psychologically. Whatever happens here will linger long after they leave the cellar, if they leave at all. In this suspended confrontation, fear begins to change shape. It does not disappear, but it becomes more complex. It is no longer just fear of violence, but fear of misreading the situation. Fear of responding incorrectly. Fear of trusting too much or resisting too little. The civilians are caught between instincts honed by survival and the possibility, however faint, that this encounter might not follow the pattern they expect. The soldiers, for their part, do not rush to resolve the tension. Their stillness suggests deliberation rather than indecision. This, too, is unsettling. The war has conditioned everyone to expect speed and force. Slowness feels unnatural. It demands attention, invites interpretation, and refuses to let fear discharge itself quickly. Instead, fear lingers, stretched thin across the moment like a wire pulled too tight. As the seconds continue to pass, the cellar becomes a threshold rather than a hiding place. The civilians are no longer simply concealed, they are encountered. The war has stepped inside their refuge, not with an explosion, but with a gaze. What that gaze will ultimately decide remains unclear, but the act of being seen cannot be undone. Whatever follows will begin here, in this charged silence, where hunger and terror meet authority face to face and wait for meaning to be assigned. As the soldiers move fully into the cellar, the confined space absorbs their presence in a way that feels disproportionate to their number. The room does not become louder or more aggressive. Instead, it feels heavier, as if the air itself has thickened. Authority settles into the cellar without announcement, carried not by shouted orders but by posture, by the careful placement of boots, by the way attention subtly shifts toward them. The civilians feel this change immediately. The room they have occupied in isolation is no longer theirs alone. It has been entered, claimed, and redefined. The soldiers' eyes adjust more quickly than the civilians expect. They begin to take in details that had faded into background for those hiding there: the uneven stacks of belongings pressed against the walls, the makeshift arrangements for sleeping, the small signs of long-term concealment that speak to endurance rather than planning. The cellar tells a story without words, and the soldiers read it silently. This is not a space prepared for resistance or ambush. It is a space shaped by waiting. The civilians sense the scrutiny and brace themselves. Their bodies stiffen reflexively, shoulders tightening, hands drawn closer to their own bodies as if to minimize themselves. They do not know how to behave under this kind of attention. Defiance feels dangerous. Submission feels humiliating and possibly futile. They settle into stillness, the only option that has not yet betrayed them. In stillness, they have survived this long. Perhaps it will serve them again. What surprises them first is the absence of contempt. The soldiers' faces do not harden in disgust or flare with anger. There is no immediate narrowing of eyes, no sharp intake of breath that signals revulsion. Instead, there is concentration, a quiet focus that suggests effort rather than judgment. The civilians have encountered looks like this before, on doctors, perhaps, or on people faced with something unexpected and fragile. The resemblance unsettles them. One soldier's gaze lingers longer than the others, not fixed on a single individual but moving slowly across the group. His eyes do not dart or avoid. They rest, absorb, move on. The civilians feel seen in a way that is unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable. This is not the look of someone assessing danger alone. It is the look of someone registering reality as it is, rather than as it has been described. The cellar's occupants feel the tension in their chests shift slightly, though none of them would dare name it as relief. The soldiers exchange brief glances among themselves. These looks are subtle, efficient, shaped by long familiarity. No words are needed to convey what has already been understood. The civilians watch these exchanges closely, searching for signs of agreement or disagreement, trying to decode their meaning. Every shared glance feels like a decision being made elsewhere, beyond their reach. Yet even here, there is no visible hostility. The civilians' fear begins to strain against this contradiction. The room remains quiet, but the quality of the silence changes. It is no longer the silence of hiding, taut, and defensive. It becomes observational, attentive. The civilians notice this shift almost instinctively. Silence, which has been their shield, now becomes something shared rather than enforced. No one breaks it, not because they are afraid to, but because the moment seems to demand it. Speech feels intrusive, like it would fracture something fragile and still forming. The soldiers lower themselves slightly, not fully sitting, but adjusting their stance in a way that brings them closer to the civilians' level. This small physical change has an outsized impact. It reduces the vertical distance that had defined the encounter since the door opened. The civilians register it with surprise. Power remains, but it is no longer towering. The gesture is practical, perhaps even unconscious, but it alters the emotional geometry of the room. The civilians begin to notice details they had been too afraid to see before. One soldier's hands tremble faintly as he adjusts his grip, not from aggression but from fatigue. Another carries a faint smell of damp wool and smoke, familiar scents that belong as much to the cellar as to the battlefield. These observations slip past fear and lodge somewhere deeper, complicating the image the civilians have held of the enemy. It becomes harder to maintain a purely abstract dread when confronted with such specificity. Hunger and exhaustion, which had dominated the civilians' awareness for days, now intersect with this new reality. Their bodies betray them in small ways. A stomach growls before it can be stilled, a cough escapes despite best efforts to suppress it. Each involuntary sound feels like a transgression. The civilians tense, expecting reprimand or reaction. None comes. The sounds pass without comment, absorbed into the silence like everything else. This restraint unsettles the civilians more than shouting would have. They have prepared themselves for cruelty because cruelty follows familiar patterns. Restraint is unpredictable. It forces interpretation, invites uncertainty, and raises questions they are unprepared to answer. Why are the soldiers not asserting control more aggressively? What are they waiting for? The civilians cannot tell whether this is the calm before punishment or something else entirely. The soldiers' eyes soften almost imperceptibly as the reality of the cellar settles in. It is not a dramatic transformation, not a visible display of emotion. It is subtle, expressed in the easing of brows, the slight slackening of jaws, the way gazes linger with something like consideration rather than suspicion. The civilians feel this shift more than they see it. It registers as a lowering of internal alarms, a change in the emotional temperature of the room. This softening does not erase the imbalance of power, but it reframes it. The soldiers remain armed, uniformed, in control of the situation. But control no longer feels synonymous with threat. The civilians struggle to reconcile this with everything they have learned about war. They have been taught that encounters like this end in dominance asserted through force. The cellar offers no evidence yet to support that belief, and the absence creates cognitive dissonance that is difficult to manage. For a moment, the civilians feel the urge to speak, to explain themselves, to justify their presence. The instinct is strong but restrained. They do not know what language to use, what tone would be safest, or whether speech would be welcomed at all. Silence remains the safest option. The soldiers, too, do not rush to fill it. The cellar exists in a fragile equilibrium, sustained by mutual restraint. The room feels smaller now, not because of crowding, but because attention is so focused. Every movement is noticed. Every breath seems amplified. And yet, within this intensity, there is an unexpected gentleness. No one is forced to move. No one is ordered to stand or kneel. The civilians are allowed to remain as they are, in positions shaped by fatigue rather than fear of immediate reprisal. This permission, implicit and unspoken, carries weight. The soldiers' expressions suggest recognition rather than judgment. They see not collaborators or combatants, but people who have been overtaken by events larger than themselves. The civilians sense this recognition without fully trusting it. They have learned that recognition does not always lead to protection. Still, its presence alters the emotional landscape of the cellar. It introduces the possibility, however remote, that this encounter might diverge from expectation. As minutes pass, the civilians' fear begins to reorganize. It does not disappear, but it loses its sharpest edge. It becomes watchful rather than paralyzing. They remain alert, aware that the situation could still turn, but they are no longer bracing for immediate impact. Their bodies loosen slightly, muscles releasing tension they did not realize they were holding. This physical change is subtle but profound. It marks the first moment since the door opened that survival feels less precarious. The silence deepens again, but now it feels intentional rather than enforced. It is as though everyone in the room understands that this moment is significant, that something has shifted which cannot be easily reversed. The war outside continues, unseen and unheard for the moment, but inside the cellar, its logic falters. Enemy and civilian occupy the same space without violence, without shouting, without immediate resolution. The civilians do not know how long this state can last. They know better than to believe in permanence. But they also know that something irreversible has occurred. They have been seen not as targets, but as people. The soldiers have allowed that recognition to surface, even briefly. In the context of war, that allowance is radical. Silence takes hold of the cellar in a way that feels heavier than anything that has come before. It is no longer the brittle silence of hiding or the tense quiet of confrontation, but something denser and more deliberate. It settles into the room like a physical presence, pressing against walls and bodies alike. No one moves to break it. The civilians feel it immediately, the way one feels a sudden drop in temperature or pressure. This silence is not imposed by threat. It is shared, sustained by an unspoken agreement that whatever is happening now is fragile and must not be disturbed. The war above continues, but it feels distant, almost unreal. Explosions and movement that once dominated every thought now seem muffled, pushed far beyond the cellar's boundaries. Inside, Attention has narrowed completely to the present moment. Every person in the room is acutely aware of everyone else. Breathing becomes measured, instinctively slowed, as if even air must be consumed carefully. The civilians realize they are listening not for danger anymore, but for intention. Weapons remain visible, undeniable reminders of power and possibility, yet they do not dominate the space. They are held without emphasis, neither raised nor dramatically lowered. Their presence is acknowledged and then set aside mentally, which in itself feels extraordinary. The civilians have learned to associate weapons with immediate outcomes. Here, the expected sequence does not unfold. The lack of escalation creates a void where certainty should be, and the silence fills that void completely. In this quiet, time stretches in an unfamiliar way. Seconds feel elongated, but not unbearable. They carry weight but not panic. The civilians sense that something is being decided, though not through orders or discussion. The decision is forming in the pauses, in the way eyes meet and then drift away, in the way bodies remain still rather than braced. It is a slow process, unfolding without spectacle, and that slowness makes it feel deliberate and consequential. The soldiers do not assert dominance through sound. There are no commands echoing off the walls, no sharp words to re-establish hierarchy. Instead, authority exists in restraint. This inversion unsettles the civilians deeply. They have been conditioned to expect control to be loud, visible, undeniable. Here, control is quiet, almost hesitant, and that hesitation suggests choice rather than inevitability. The war's usual logic feels suspended, as if it has been momentarily set aside. The civilians become intensely aware of their own vulnerability. Without the immediate pressure of threat, their exhaustion surfaces more fully. Shoulders sag slightly, heads lower. Hunger and fatigue, held at bay by adrenaline, begin to reassert themselves. A few shift their weight unconsciously, easing cramped muscles that have been held rigid for too long. Each movement feels risky, but no one reacts. The silence absorbs these small adjustments without protest. Eyes continue to move through the room, but their purpose has changed. The soldiers are no longer scanning for danger alone. Their gazes linger, taking in faces individually rather than collectively. Wrinkles, hollowed cheeks, the dull sheen of skin deprived of proper nourishment. These details are registered quietly, without commentary. The civilians feel exposed in a new way, not as suspects, but as evidence of what prolonged fear and deprivation look like. Being seen like this is unsettling, but it is not humiliating. It is something closer to acknowledgement. The silence deepens again, layered now with awareness. The civilians begin to realize that this quiet is not empty. It is full of restraint, consideration, and the unspoken weight of consequence. Whatever happens next will be shaped by this moment, by the fact that violence did not immediately follow discovery. The absence of action becomes an action in itself, one that cannot be undone. For the soldiers, the silence offers space to process what they are encountering. The war has trained them to categorize quickly, to identify threats and respond with efficiency. The cellar resists such categorization. It presents no clear tactical problem, only a human one. The soldiers stand in a room where victory offers no visible reward and force offers no clear benefit. The silence allows this reality to settle in fully, unfiltered by urgency. The civilians sense this internal recalibration, though they cannot articulate it. They feel it as a loosening of pressure, a subtle shift from fear of imminent harm to uncertainty about what comes next. This uncertainty is unsettling, but it is also less suffocating than terror. It leaves room for breath, for thought, for the faint possibility of outcomes that do not end in loss. No one speaks because speech feels inadequate. Words would simplify what is happening, reduce it to familiar categories. Silence preserves complexity. It allows contradictory truths to coexist, that these men are armed occupiers, and that they are also capable of restraint, that the civilians are powerless, and that their presence has influenced the course of events simply by being what it is. The cellar holds all of this without resolution. The room feels suspended outside normal time. The civilians are no longer counting minutes until discovery or death. They are inhabiting a moment that feels oddly complete, as though it exists for its own sake rather than as a prelude to something else. This sensation is unfamiliar and disorienting. War rarely allows moments like this, where nothing is demanded and nothing is taken. Breathing becomes audible again, though still quiet. Someone exhales slowly, deliberately, as if testing whether it is safe to do so. The sound does not draw attention. It merges with the ambient presence of others, reinforcing the sense that this is now a shared space rather than a contested one. The civilians exchange brief glances among themselves, subtle and cautious. They do not smile. They do not relax fully. But something like recognition passes between them. They are aware that they are witnessing something rare. The silence carries a moral weight that is difficult to define. It is not the silence of complicity or fear alone. It is the silence of choice not yet acted upon. The soldier's restraint is active, not passive. It requires effort, discipline, and the willingness to deviate from expectation. The civilians sense this effort, even if they cannot name it, and it changes how they perceive the men standing among them. The cellar, once a place of concealment, becomes a place of encounter. Its walls no longer exist solely to hide those within, but to contain this moment of suspended judgment. The civilians feel the space differently now. It is still cramped and damp, still uncomfortable and cold, but it no longer feels like a trap. It feels like a threshold, a point at which outcomes diverge. The silence stretches on, and with it, the understanding that not all power is exercised through force. The war has taught everyone involved that violence is the primary language of control. Here, another language is being spoken, one without words. It communicates through stillness, through the deliberate choice not to escalate, through the recognition that once violence begins, it cannot be selectively undone. For the civilians, this realization is almost overwhelming. They have lived under conditions where mercy feels theoretical at best, a concept discussed after the fact rather than experienced directly. In this cellar, mercy is not declared or dramatized. It is enacted quietly, through omission rather than gesture. Nothing happens, and that nothingness is everything. The silence also carries risk. Everyone understands that it could be broken at any moment, that a single decision could unravel it completely. This awareness keeps the civilians alert, preventing complacency. They remain poised between hope and caution, aware that the balance is fragile. Yet even this fragility feels preferable to the certainty of harm they had anticipated. As the minutes pass, the silence becomes almost sacred in its intensity. It demands respect, even from those who do not consciously frame it that way. The civilians sense that speaking now would diminish the gravity of what is unfolding. The soldiers seem to share this instinct. The cellar becomes a space where words are unnecessary, where meaning is carried entirely by presence and restraint. This silence does not resolve the war or even the encounter. It does not promise safety or future protection. But it does something perhaps more significant. It interrupts the automatic progression from discovery to violence. It inserts a pause into a system designed to move relentlessly forward. In that pause, humanity surfaces, not dramatically, not sentimentally, but undeniably. When the silence finally begins to loosen its hold, it does so gently, without rupture. It leaves behind a changed atmosphere, one in which the civilians are no longer simply hiding and the soldiers are no longer simply searching. They share the knowledge that something important has occurred, even if they cannot yet see its full shape. The cellar remains what it has always been, dark, cramped, imperfect, but it now holds the memory of restraint, and that memory will endure long after the sounds of war reclaim the space above. The shift from silence to action happens so gradually that it is almost imperceptible at first. There is no announcement, no clear signal that the moment of suspended judgment has ended. Instead, movement returns to the cellar in fragments, careful and restrained, as if everyone involved is testing the boundaries of what has been established. The civilians feel it in the subtle reorientation of the soldiers' bodies, in the way weight shifts from one foot to another, in the slight relaxation of shoulders that had been held rigid not by threat, but by deliberation. Power is still present, unmistakable and unevenly distributed, but it no longer presses down with the same suffocating force. The civilians sense that something has changed in how that power is being exercised. It is no longer poised solely for enforcement. It is being shaped, redirected, filtered through choice. This realization arrives slowly, met first with suspicion. The civilians have survived too long by distrusting sudden changes in tone. They remain alert, watching every gesture for signs of reversal.